All right. Some participants are starting to come into the room, so I'll let that open up before I start the introduction. To let everybody in from the waiting room.
Yep, that's great.
Will we be able to get a copy of the recording, Jocelyn?
Yes, I'll send it to you.
Thanks.
All right, so people are still coming in, but I want to maximize our time, and some of my intro is a little housekeeping, so we'll get that started. So welcome everybody to the Harvard Law School Library Faculty Book Talk Series. I'm Jocelyn Kennedy, the Executive Director of the library. Delighted to have you all here with us today. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping items. We are recording this talk and we'll post it to our YouTube channel next week. You should check out our Scholarship at Law blog for more information on that. I want to thank Dean Manning for his continued support of these talks. It's so important. And a big thank you to our team, June Casey, Rachel Parker, Maya Bergamasco, and Teresa Knapp, who've helped to put together this series. We welcome your questions for our author. So as we go along, we invite you to use the Q&A feature throughout the talk. Time will be reserved at the end of the presentation for our authors and speakers to engage with your questions. Visit your local bookseller or wherever you buy books to purchase today's book. You can also visit the Harvard Library to borrow the book as well. So it's my pleasure to introduce our discussants for today's book, Fault Lines in the Constitution, the graphic novel. Sanford Levinson is a visiting professor of law here at Harvard Law School and the W. St. John Garwood and W. St. John Garwood Jr. Centennial Chair in Law at the University of Texas Law School. He's the author of many books on the U.S. Constitution and other subjects, is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and received the Lifetime Achievement Award of the Law and Court section of the American Political Science Association in 2010. Cynthia Lewis is a renowned nonfiction writer. She writes about social justice for young readers, including The Youngest Marcher and Watch Out for Flying Kids. Arkan Fung is the Winthrop Laughlin McCormick Professor of Citizenship and Self-Government at the Harvard Kennedy School. He co-directs the Transparency Policy Project and leads democratic governance programs of the Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation. His books include Full Disclosure, The Perils and Promise of Transparency, and Empowered Participation, Reinventing Urban Democracy. Although this book is written for middle and high school students, this graphic novel really offers an exploration through illustration and compelling discourse how today's political struggles have their origins in the decisions of the founders, making the founding of our country and our continued struggles accessible to the young and less young alike. Understanding history helps us make sense of the world as it is today. In a time where the world seems upside down, Fault Lines in the Constitution contextualizes our country's struggles in becoming a more perfect union and offers some solutions to achieve the goals set in motion almost 250 years ago. So with that, I will turn it over to our speakers. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jocelyn.
Thank you so much, Jocelyn. Thanks everyone joining us this afternoon for this discussion of Cynthia and Sandy's fantastic new book, a different version of a book that they wrote a couple of years ago. And it's a great time, a very important time to have this discussion, probably not for the people in the audience, but for many Americans, the Constitution is, I think, played a background role, something that people don't have to think about very much, something that they can take for granted, like the cobblestones on a sidewalk or something like that. And to paraphrase Leon Trotsky, it's becoming more and more evident these days that even if you don't care about the Constitution cares about you. And the visibility of these constitutional rules just are becoming much more controversial. Think about the controversy over Justice Ginsburg's passing and the nomination of Judge Barrett to fill her seat, or the systematic misalignment between the Electoral College and the popular vote winners in recent presidential elections. Supreme Court nominations and the Electoral College we, for at least most of my life, taken that as just part of the, I don't know, the window shades, the window dressing of government and the Constitution. But now the controversies over these and many, many other features of the Constitution are indicators that our structures of democratic governance, the rules of our democracy, aren't generating very good governance right now. That's why Cynthia Levinson and Sanford Levinson's new book, Fault Lines in the Constitution, comes at exactly the right moment. And I'm really excited to talk about the book today. Just here's the cover of the book. And for those of you who don't have it yet, you should run out and get it. And it's notable. So the first version of the book came out in 2017, and we're discussing the second version of the book of the same title. But it's not just a different edition that came out. You should get both versions of the book. Here is a page from the introduction to the 2017 version of the book. Looks like many books that people in the room read, that many people in the room have written. However, this is the analogous page, the corresponding page from the 2020 version of the book, which I dare say probably not too many people in the Zoom meeting have written books that look like the 2020 book. As you can see, it's a graphic novel, and we'll discuss the choice and what difference that makes to the writing of the book, to its audience, to what you're saying in a moment. Just a few comments why I like the book so much, both versions of the book, is that it is the Constitution its due respect, but lays out very concrete problems and is constructively critical in the best possible way. And almost every chapter begins with a disturbing and very concrete problem, not an abstract problem. For instance, chapter 1 begins with a very disturbing fact that anti-lynching legislation was first introduced in 1918. But still, despite many, many pushes, we don't have a federal anti-lynching law. Then each chapter traces how this presenting kind of current problem goes back to and is deeply related to features, deficits, if you like, of the US Constitution. And then each chapter looks at what we can do about it. This part is I think we need more of this in discussions about the US Constitution, because Cynthia and Sandy in their what to do about it exploration look toward the Constitution of US states, different constitutions of the states, and the constitutions of other countries to say, hey, look, it's done. There's a lot of different alternatives here. There's a lot of different models. Our 1787 Constitution might not be the one best way. Let's look at different ways to solve these problems, to skin this cat. And that gives a lot of leverage to generating solutions. The book is a highly relevant and constructive tour de force that seeks to look at these different alternatives to solve these problems. And one of the my favorite pages in the book comes from when Justice Ginsburg is visiting Egypt and thinking about the constitution that they should have after the Egyptian revolution. And she says, I would not look at the US Constitution if I were drafting a constitution in the year 2012. It's too old and not as likely to be helpful as, say, the South African Constitution, which was drafted much, much later, of course. We're still trying to form a more perfect union. And then to capture one common line of response, Glenn Beck, popular radio and television personality, says in response to Justice Ginsburg, is it too much to ask for a Supreme Court justice to have a little reverence for the Constitution of the United States? I think she does have did have a lot of reverence for the Constitution of the United States, but was appropriately and constructively critical, as Sandy and Cynthia are. And then I want to hop to one of the last pages in the book to give you the punchline a little bit, and then we can have a discussion about how we got there. One of the last pages of the book gives the Constitution a grade for some of its aspirational statements. To form a more perfect union, so far the Constitution, in their estimation, gets a C-, establishing justice a C, ensuring domestic tranquility, another C, providing for the common defense, a little bit better there, a B, promoting the general welfare, they give it a C-, and then secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, a B-. Grade point average of C for the Constitution. And so let's find out how we got there, and then importantly, looking forward, whether we can do a little bit better, whether we can get the Constitution's grade average a little bit higher, maybe to a B or an A- in the years and decades ahead. Wouldn't that be nice? Okay, so a couple of questions. Before we get into the political and constitutional issues that are real meat of the book, let's talk about the format that you guys chose. What made you two decide to follow up your more conventional book with a graphic novel? Who are you trying to reach? Who wants to go first?
Cynthia.
I'll take this one. First of all, we want to thank the Harvard Law School and Archon for hosting this. We're very, very grateful, and we appreciate everybody from the Kennedy School and the Ed School for being here, and everybody else. So thanks for coming. So the format. Yeah, you showed both versions, Archon, and the original one looks like a pretty typical, middle school, high school book with lots of text and also some fun illustrations. But the editor of the graphic novel actually brought the idea to us, and we were thrilled because we know how effective graphic novels can be for different kinds of learners, but also different kinds of readers in general. I read both regular books with text in it and also graphic novels because there are so many in a wide variety, fiction and nonfiction, and they can be tremendously compelling for young people or any person who may be distracted by reading a page of text, or whose English language skills aren't developed yet, or who just appreciate seeing, and we also need to thank Ali Schwed, who did the fantastic illustrations. We think her drawings are wonderfully wry and witty. So anyone who appreciates her drawings as a component to the words will enjoy this book. We think it's a great way for young people to be introduced to problems with the Constitution. The picture you showed, one of the pictures you showed, Archon, of a framer tossing King George's crown into the wastebasket, that gives everybody an idea of the tone of this book, which everybody says, actually about both books, is very accessible. And this is accessible to a wider audience.
Yeah, if I can jump in for just a second, I do think that this is part of a genuine cultural development, for better and for worse, with regard to other forms of publication or the access to knowledge than traditional books. I will confess, many years ago, to reading Watchmen, along with comic books as a kid, reading Watchmen and thinking that this is a brand new world. But I can't say that I became a fan of the graphic novel. I just knew it was a phenomenon. But I do think it is something that now exists. Macmillan is publishing our book as part of what they call the World Citizen Comics. They have a book called Unrig about our election system. The memoirs of Dan Rather are coming out in this format. And, this is not the world that I grew up in, but I think it is very much a reality of the world that our students live in.
That's funny. I was telling my son, who's a precocious senior at Brookline High School, about this event, and I showed him the book, and he read a couple of chapters of it. And he said, well, I think this is, and in our correspondence before, the event, you said Macmillan was not necessarily marketing this to young readers, but to a much broader audience. And my son said, yeah, I get that. That's a good decision, because people my age, we're perfectly capable of reading the first book. It's the kind of New York Times readers who want to feel informed, but aren't paying all that much attention. They need the graphic novel, so it's for them. So that's one high school senior's view. Very good.
Yeah.
Okay, so this one I want to ask both of you. So maybe first Sandy and then Cynthia. What is your favorite chapter in the book? And by that, I mean, each chapter lays out a big problem, its origins in the Constitution, and some solutions. What's your favorite problem and solution from the book? Sandy.
Favorite, of course, has to have scare quotes around it, because I think by far the worst feature of the Constitution is Article 5, which makes it next to impossible to amend the Constitution, and therefore discourages conversations of the kind we're having right now that require addressing the possibility of constitutional change. So in terms of the importance of the point, I suppose, I would identify that, but my answer would differ in a sense, different days and what's in the news. You mentioned the first chapter on lynching. One of my projects is to rehabilitate Warren Harding as not deserving to be at the very bottom of the list of presidents. He was the first president to support an anti-lynching law. And so in a sense, I hope that readers realize that Harding had some virtues as well as not. But to answer your question directly, it's about Article 5.
Oh, great. Cynthia, what about you? Your most favorite is an odd word choice. So most important
Right. No,
problem and solution.
Yeah, no, but within this context, it's very understandable. There are so many options. We go through 20 fault lines in the book, but I've decided while working on it that I think the least equitable, the most unjust aspect of our Constitution is the Senate. Everybody sort of takes it for granted. I mean, there are complaints, but especially young people who are learning about our government. Yes, we have a bicameral legislature and a three-part government, but really, as time goes on, 2 senators per state, regardless of the size of the population, is definitely, I think, the most problematic.
It's very good. In this conversation, and thinking about the Ginsburg visit to Egypt and South Africa, we hadn't talked about this before, but how much of the problem of the US Constitution is about authorship? So I did an event with somebody, an expert on India, and then a few days later, a different one with someone from South Africa. And, the Indian Constitution, a couple of the authors were, of course, Mahatma Gandhi and then Ambedkar, and both of them in quite different ways were very set. A central objective was eliminating the caste system, eliminating caste inequalities in India. And similarly, obviously, for the South African Constitution, dismantling the structure of apartheid and racial and white supremacy in that country was a very central objective. And here from page 1, right, a bunch of the authors, not all of them, but many of the authors of our Constitution were concerned with preserving the structure of racial hierarchy. So how much of that original sin is, I don't know, I don't want to say insurmountable, but kind of baked in a very deep way that in some of these more modern constitutions with authors who have just a much more egalitarian impulse in their societies, it doesn't face the same so how much of it goes to the authorship of the text all of more than 200 years ago?
I mean, that's an extraordinarily important question. Part of American exceptionalism is, and this is, the Glenn Beck quote that you put up, that Americans venerate their Constitution in a way that I think is not true anywhere else in the world. And it's not true in any of the states. And to venerate the Constitution translates in the United States into venerating the founders as a collective group. And as you say, many of them and almost all of the presidents owned slaves. So one last point before turning it over to Cynthia. I'm teaching a reading course this term at the University of Texas on race in the Constitution. And in some ways, it is a course about the 1619 Project, which I presume people who are tuning in know about, including the fact that it's extremely controversial because there is this real struggle between the proponents of the 1619 Project and someone like, say, Bret Stephens, whom I quite admire, conservative columnist for the Times, who wrote a vigorous critique of the 1619 Project in favor of 1776 and the framers. And I think that your question gets to the heart of the deepest cultural struggle or political struggle that is going on right now in the United States.
Yeah, I mean, I really don't need to add to that, but I talked with Sandy a lot about that as we were working on the book, because obviously he had, the substantive, the content knowledge about the book much more than I did. I was the scribe. But one of my basic questions was, in what ways does the Constitution remain a race-based document? To what extent does race and slavery continue to infuse our government? We had a lot of conversations about that. And that's why actually you referred to the opening chapter in the story about lynching. And that's why the opening chapter is about that.
Yeah, very important. And this next question goes to constitutional culture, the Bret Stephens kind of point and the 1619 point. I found the book extremely refreshing and surprising in its openness to many, many different changes. Like in these 20 chapters, each one offers a number of very profound changes to constitutional arrangements. And I wonder the extent to which you think your book, whether it's possible to write such a book now that recommends these changes, whether we're experiencing a moment that's much more open to constitutional change. So when I was in graduate school, that was back in the 90s, the 1990s, I remember when Bill Clinton withdrew our colleague, Harvard Law School colleague Lonnie Guinier's nomination to head the Civil Rights Division of the DOJ. And one of her principal sins was that she had explored possibilities of introducing proportional representation into the United States through cumulative voting and local elections and other places. That doesn't seem as radical now as it did then. We're talking about ranked choice voting in the upcoming Massachusetts ballot primary, and they already have it in a few other states, right? And so I wonder, so the 1990s, back then, it seemed like this constitutional reverence was just rock solid. You couldn't, it was unmovable. At least it looked that way to me, experiencing Lonnie Guinier's withdrawal, et cetera. Do you feel that now, in terms of the openness to constitutional change, we're much more open and considering a lot more things? And why is that? And then to the book specifically, have you received much feedback about either applauding the dramatic openness and consideration of alternatives, or on the other hand, much hostility, saying, you're un-American, this is the Constitution, don't you understand the founders and our exceptional place?
Sandy, why don't you start and then I'll follow on.
Yeah. With regard to your central question, first of all, I think it will very much depend on what happens in November. But I will say very candidly that one of my critiques of what passes for the American left is that it has embraced constitutional reverence more since the 1990s than, makes sense, in part because, ironically enough, although the right wing is identified with originalism and a certain notion of patriotism, they have also really advocated some significant constitutional changes. The far-right governor of Texas, a couple of years ago, put out what he called the Texas Plan, which had 9 revisions of the Constitution, several of them of genuine importance. That hasn't gone anywhere. But the point is, he advocated it and even called for a new constitutional convention. The response of most people was not simply to say, Governor Abbott, you're wrong on the specifics, but rather, how dare you suggest that the Constitution needs any significant change, and you must be crazy in calling for a new constitutional convention. No doubt we'll talk about this last more in a moment, because Cynthia and I more or less conclude our book with a very vigorous debate about having a new constitutional convention. But I do think that, and I go so far as to say, even the left now seems to be tiptoeing up to thinking about dysfunctionalities and problems with the Constitution itself. But quite frankly, I have no idea to what degree Joe Biden, who is a man of the Senate, he represented what was in 1787 the smallest state in the Union. Is he prepared to think more radically? And I have no idea.
My impression, Archon, is that everybody is engaging in some cognitive dissonance. Everybody who thinks about the Constitution and possibilities or needs for change is engaging in some cognitive dissonance. On the one hand, I think people would like to feel attached to the Constitution, to our government, but can't right now for various reasons, and are uncomfortable, understandably uncomfortable with that. So as Sandy said, as you said, 30 years ago, it was a badge of honor to be committed to the Constitution, and it was unpatriotic to criticize it, particularly for people on the right. Now that's changing. There does seem to be some growing development of interest by people, especially on the right, to change the Constitution, possibly in part to establish an end to governmental debt, which is, one of the issues that Sandy and I debate in terms of a convention. So I think there's discomfort and uncertainty about what to do. In response to your question about what sort of responses we're getting to the book, interestingly, nobody has accused us of being, say, unpatriotic. We get responses that say, this is a nonpartisan book. It's very balanced. It's very careful not to take one side or another. As Andy said, he wants to resurrect Warren Harding, for instance. As you know, one of the heroes of the book is Phyllis Schlafly, who succeeded in preventing the passage of the Equal Rights.
Heroes with a scare quote.
Well,
Yeah.
On the other hand, some people have said this is a highly partisan book. It's very left wing. Nobody has said it's very right wing. So we get skewed responses, and this continues because we blog about the book. The book is so current. We blog updates to it every month at www.faultlinesintheconstitution.com, and we get responses of both kinds to our blog posts.
Yeah, in a sense, I wish that your son were joining us right now, because I really don't know what kids your son's age or a 17-year-old granddaughter would answer to this question. A couple of years ago, the American Legion Boy State in Texas voted to secede, much to the embarrassment of the American Legion. Now, you could say these are boys being boys, but there is polling data showing that a significant number of people between, say, 18 and either 29 or 39 can contemplate with some equanimity, at least theoretically, the idea of the Union breaking up. And thus having none of what Lincoln called the mystic chords of memory that would make the United States a self-evident good. But, my hope, my strongest hope, is that in the classes that are using the book, and we've been gratified by the number of teachers and librarians all over the country who are using the book, who have asked us to speak to their classes. My hope is that they're having really serious conversations among their students of a kind that I certainly never had what is now 65 years ago when I was going to school in North Carolina, or I strongly suspect were not occurring even 10 or 15 years ago in such civic education courses as still exist in the United States.
Yeah, I really agree. And this goes to a little bit the current issues about what people are talking about in classrooms. I imagine even the book came out this year, but it's been a long year in many, many ways. And I imagine even since it's come out, you've had thoughts about changing priorities for the Constitution and for our democracy. And so in light of all of these crises, the pandemic, the economic crisis, the racial reckoning, some fear that this election and its result may be the most contested in our memory. Some people are saying democracy itself is on the ballot. And there's a question in the Q&A about this. In light of the election 2020, one way to put it is, what do you think is the most important fault line in the Constitution? And then Ko Young-Tung puts it in the more constructive way. What constitutional amendment would you recommend as being most vital for our country and right now in the near future, and why?
Well, let me just start with the first part of the question. Although the Senate, I think, is the greatest sort of infused problem, right now it's the Electoral College that has to be the most severe problem. I mean, as we know, 5 times now in our history so far, a person has become president who did not win the most popular votes. It could happen again, as we know. And it's not only the outcome of the election, but it's the input into the election. As we go into in the book, the Electoral College skews where the candidates spend their time, where they spend their money, what issues they talk about. It just overrides everything. So eliminating the Electoral College and adopting a popular vote would have to be the change that I would go for in regard to the election. Sandy talked about the difficulty of amending the Constitution, and although apparently polls indicate that a majority of the population would like to eliminate the Electoral College Constitution, that does not seem in the offing. And you brought up, Archon, the various other sorts of recommendations that we make. So we talk about here, I've got some right here, the eliminate winner take all. Some states have winner take all for Electoral College allocation of votes, and some are more proportional. Another one is the National Popular Vote Plan, where each state would allocate its votes for the winner of the national vote. That actually is moving along, but it's gotten stalled. So that's what I would say. Sandy, what would your answer be?
Yeah, Archon's colleague, Alex Kaiser, has just published a terrific book with the Harvard Press called Why Do We Still Have the Electoral College? And he points out that criticism of the Electoral College began in 1816. And by the 1820s, James Madison was a real critic of the Electoral College, but we still got it. And Alex's book is a wonderful book, among other things, on the difficulty of constitutional amendment. So I really do think that in some ways it is Article 5 that infantilizes us as a body politic, because if you're sophisticated, you know that supporting constitutional amendment, especially if it's structural amendment, is going to be a losing proposition. So if I could change, if I'm giving magic wand and I could change only one thing, I would not only make it easier to amend the Constitution, but I would also include what you find in roughly half the American states and in many respectable foreign countries around the world, including Switzerland and New Zealand, which we don't think of as crazy countries, the possibility for direct democracy. Most legal academics are bitterly opposed to direct democracy. I think, in a minority of people who think that one of the real weaknesses of the United States Constitution is that, as Mike Klarman pointed out in his book, it was drafted by anti-democrats who were terrified of popular government. And so we, the people, have no opportunity, in essence, to seize control of the government other than through revolution. And that is not a good idea.
That's fascinating. And for those of you interested in the court and the Constitution of democracy, another colleague, Charles Freed, has a great op-ed in the New York Times today that talks about particular court decisions. He doesn't frame it like this, but they're all about democracy decisions. He talks about Janus, the Voting Rights Act, Citizens United, gerrymandering. He thinks that those aren't going in a good way from the Democratic perspective.
Right. I mean, political scientists, as I'm sure you know, spent a lot of time arguing that Alex Bickel's notion of the counter-majoritarian difficulty was way over stressed, that the Supreme Court, when all is said and done, kind of represents the median voter. I don't think anybody believes that anymore. The current Supreme Court is significantly to the right of the median voter, particularly on issues involving little d democracy.
Good. And then, so last question before we turn to some of the great questions in the audience. So feel free to type your questions in the Zoom Q&A function. We'll be turning to the questions from other folks in a moment. But before we do that, I want to jump to the end of the book, where the two of you have a fascinating, heated, even dialogue, debate about how to begin to repair these many constitutional faults that the prior 19 chapters identify. And Sandy is open to the big controversial step of a constitutional convention. And, even on the left, maybe especially on the left, this is a very controversial proposal. And Cynthia, you're more reluctant, preferring a slower, more incremental, sometimes frustrating, as those of you who I recommend Mrs. America, the great Hulu special about Gloria Steinem and Barbara and Betty Friedan and Phyllis Schlafly fighting it out over the ERA, right? It was a very frustrating process for the feminists in the early 70s, just like 1 or 2 states short, really frustrating. But nevertheless, that's the path you recommend. And so I'm going to ask you to reprise that debate a little bit, but reverse roles. So Sandy, would you briefly explain what a constitutional convention mechanism is, right? Because I bet some folks in the discussion don't have a clear understanding about what that would look like. And think about what might be the bad outcomes from such a convention. What are the problems that that Cynthia is worried about?
Well, let me say that I think Cynthia makes by far the best arguments against a convention because, and obviously she'll speak for herself in a moment, she does not emphasize what most of our friends tend to emphasize, which is the fear of the so-called runaway convention. Instead, what she notes completely accurately is that Article 5 sets up the possibility of a new convention if 2/3 of the states petition for it. But otherwise, Article 5 doesn't provide a clue as to what the convention would actually look like. How would the delegates be selected? What would the voting rules be? How broad would the agenda be? Larry Lessig and I taught a seminar together at the Harvard Law School about 5 years ago on a so-called Article 5 convention. And I concluded, not really believing, but at least, tempted by the idea that Article 5 was a demonic plot by the framers who wanted to make sure that there would never in fact be a convention by providing no information and then making us realize that it would be something of a Pandora's box over sheer procedural questions. So that is the awkward answer to your question. That is to say, Larry and I could do a full semester trying to answer your question because the Constitution is so opaque on what the real answer is. And then Cynthia provides a good argument that we could tear each other apart simply getting to a convention before anybody actually proposed the Texas plan, the Virginia plan, the Massachusetts plan, or whatever.
Yeah. Good. Cynthia.
On the other hand, conveying Sandy's position in the book, I love this idea, Archon. The Constitution is so hard to change, and you really pointed out, Archon, something close to my heart, that we do not have an ERA because of how hard it is to amend the Constitution. And we go through so many issues. The only way that we're going to get consistent, whole cloth, wholesale change is through a Constitution convention that would look at our system of government, the structures of the government across the board. Otherwise, we might end up with a patchwork, some things working, some not, some things getting changed sooner, others later. We do have a number of suggestions throughout the book on how to resolve the issues that we talk about, such as senatorial rules changes, for instance, getting rid of the filibuster, or various legal changes. But that's really a patchwork. It might not be such a bad thing to have what's called a runaway convention. Now, what people are concerned about is that we're going to lose the Bill of Rights. Well, one of the points that Sandy makes is this is the people's government. This is the way the framers set it up. We need to be able to trust the people to be reasonable and thoughtful and to negotiate with one another, to compromise if necessary, and sitting down together in a sort of perhaps citizen jury sort of format may be the most productive and consistent way to come up with a better Constitution.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
How did I do, Sandy?
Yep.
Conveying your view.
Yep.
And for those of you interested in constitutional processes and some innovations there, I would recommend a political theorist named Ellen Landemore at Yale University. Has come out with a book, and she's written a bunch of articles about popular constitutional processes in places like Ireland and Iceland that we have the 1787 Constitution. We have this picture of elites kind of getting together and then hashing it out and then going big. Some of these more modern constitutional processes begin with a randomly selected group of citizens and then use the internet to get wide input on what new provisions should be in the Constitution. And so there's an opportunity now to flip it and have these constitutional revision processes be very, very open and small d democratic.
Yeah, it's sort of a Jim Fishkin style of pulling
Yeah.
together a randomly selected group of people and coming up with a proposal. And then that could be distributed to the states if we could figure out who in the states would make the decision.
I mean, constitutional design is not rocket science. It requires hashing out debates about, do you want more hospitals or fire trucks? And, I admire the Kennedy School, but quite frankly, the Kennedy School cannot supply the definitive answer to that question. It is testing your risk aversions. And in addition to the fire trucks and the hospitals, what about swimming pools and museums? And if you are a little d Democrat, then you've got to trust that our fellow citizens can have cogent conversations about whether scarce resources should be put into fire trucks or museums or swimming pools or hospitals.
I quite agree with that. So we have some great questions already, so please keep them coming. If you're watching on the Zoom, please, you can participate by asking a question in the Q&A function. The first one is from Professor Randall Kennedy, who asks, should a citizen of the United States, quote, love, close quote, the Constitution? And if not, what should be the sentiment with which Americans approach the Constitution? Great question.
I think it was about 10 years ago or so. It was just after David Souter had retired from the Supreme Court. So maybe it's only 9, it doesn't matter, 9, 10 years ago. But a panel of us, I was teaching physically at the Harvard Law School that semester instead of from Austin, Texas, like this semester. So the panel included Charles Fried, myself, Mark Tushnet, Mike Klarman, and Alex Kazar. And it turned out that almost all of us were critical, really critical of the Constitution. Charles was the defender of the Constitution, though he agreed that the Electoral College should go. Afterward, Noah Feldman interviewed Justice Souter. And the very first question that Noah asked Justice Souter was, do you venerate the Constitution? And Justice Souter said, no, my job was to apply the Constitution, not to valorize it or to criticize it, but to treat it as something that does in fact structure our polity. And you hired me to offer good faith interpretations. I thought that was a wonderful, wonderful answer. So I think somewhere between Justice Souter's answer and what George Lukács, the communist theorist in Hungary back in the 19-teens, once described as, quote, the fearless communist attitude toward law, unquote, which he said, to a good communist, the law is like a train schedule. It's something you have to take into account if you want to get from Budapest to Vienna. But you don't love the train schedule. You regard it as structuring how you get from Budapest to Vienna. So that is my view of the Constitution. One very last point before turning it over to Cynthia. We do not engage in founder bashing. We emphasize that the founders were doing the best they could given tough political circumstances in 1787. The people we bash or I bash are ourselves, who do not have the audacious spirit to question that the founders did. So, I think one can admire the founders, even if truth be known, some of the slaveholders without saying that what they did deserves this kind of ridiculous veneration that is often addressed to the Constitution.
Wonderful.
Yeah, I would merely add that having written this book, I would certainly say I don't love the Constitution, but in general, Randy's question was, should Americans love the Constitution?
Yes.
And I would say I don't see how they could, because they're in almost every demographic group, whether it's minorities or immigrants or seniors, even white people who are becoming minority, are disadvantaged in different ways through different aspects of the Constitution. In terms of how we should look at it, pun intended, I would say with judicious consideration.
Mm-hmm.
One last thing, we
yeah.
have a very nice blurb on the back of the print edition from Heidi Schreck, who authored, starred in, and it's now available on Netflix, her play, What the Constitution Means to Me. And one of the reasons she gave us this wonderful blurb is that she in part drew on our book for the conclusion of her play, which is a debate about the Constitution. And her play is really fascinating because it is the transformation from a 15-year-old who won American Legion contests on what the Constitution meant to her, greatest document ever written, to the 49-year-old who does not hate the Constitution, but who is much, much more skeptical about the Constitution. So see the play, but I think it captures the feeling that we wish to convey.
I'm so glad you brought that up. And I'll just read the last sentence related to civics education, because one of the things she said is, I wish every student in America would read it.
Mm-hmm. So
your son notwithstanding.
he will. He started it. So pull on another thread of this, which comes from Stephen Jacobs in the audience. So perhaps what you've been talking about is more the specific provisions of the Constitution, but what about the spirit of the Constitution and constitutionalism? And so here's Stephen Jacobs' question, comes at it from a slightly different direction, which I think is very useful. He says, one recent openly voiced criticism of our president by alarmed former military leaders is that he's more loyal to himself than the Constitution. They note that the military pledge is not to the president, but to the Constitution. This is an important principle to observe, Stephen says. How can we change the bathwater without seeming to toss the baby? That is, we very much want some powerful people to be constrained by constitutional values, and in particular, an oath to the structure rather than particular figures operating within that structure like the president. And so I think the worry is that if we crank down the sentimentality, maybe we throw out the baby with the bathwater and things can go really bad.
That's, again, a terrific question. Constitutionalism as an idea goes all the way back to Aristotle. And it conveys to many, many people, particularly after the 17th or 18th centuries, a system of government devoted to the general, to the preamble. We love the preamble. General welfare, establishing justice, securing the blessings of liberty. So yes, Donald Trump is a horror show in terms of the values of the Constitution as exemplified in the preamble. If we were doing a third edition, though, of the book, I think it might be worthwhile to do a separate chapter on the president as commander-in-chief. Because one of the really horrifying realities, and this was captured in a New York Times article just last week, is that in part because of the commander-in-chief clause, in part because of delegation by Congress of immense powers to the president after World War II, well before Donald Trump. It may be that the president has the legal authority to order a nuclear attack on any country in the world, so that the most fundamental problem with the military is whether the military as a professional cadre would feel duty bound to accept crazy orders from the commander in chief, or whether, as in Turkey, they would feel empowered in effect to engage in a military coup in order to save the Constitution. So Steve's question gets at horrifically challenging aspects of the difference between an overall constitutional order and the specific constitutional system that we operate under.
I think also, hi, Steve, thanks for joining us. I think also underlying the question is the issue of, can we respect the role of the federal government, but not the structures that compose it right now? There certainly has been, well, we should probably go on to the last question rather than my elaborating, because I know there's one more and we're almost out of time.
There's just one more. And this is a question that's on, I think, a lot of people's minds about electoral college reform. Maybe not a lot of people in Cambridge, but a lot of people in the country. If the electoral college is eliminated and the popular vote is instituted, can you explain how the votes of Americans in smaller states would be affected? Won't the president be elected by voters in California, New York, and Florida, since they have the most voters?
Okay, my quick answer to that question is that it's the very same question about the US Senate. If Wyoming were deprived of its equal voting power in California, wouldn't that mean that Wyomingites or, Dakotans who grow corn and soy would be deprived of their handsome subsidies they get? The answer might be yes. My view is that the US Senate is an affirmative action program for the residents of small states. And so the question I would turn on the questioner is whether he or she would support giving extra voting power to your favorite group. That, that if you pick whatever group it is, you want to safeguard the rights of religious minorities. So why not give each person enrolled in a religious denomination 4 or 5 votes, while those of us who are secular would get only 1 vote? That's crazy. And so I think if you believe in little d democracy and the notion of 1 person, 1 vote, then you can't really say that people in Wyoming ought to count for more than people in California.
Good. Cynthia.
I would just say, in answer to the questioner, yes. So what's the problem? We have a federal system. We will retain a federal system where states will matter. But for our presidency, yes, I think the majority of the people should pick the president.
Yeah. My 2 cents on that, just to add a little, is to Maura's question, I think we don't know, in the sense that, if we adopted one of Cynthia's proposals, either proportional allocation of the electors or the national popular vote, politics would just be very, very different. Like in Massachusetts, I feel completely ignored by both presidential campaigns. Why? Because they can ignore me, because Massachusetts is to a certainty going to vote, all of its electoral college votes will go Democratic. And without the electoral college, the conservative politicians would be able to invest a lot more in appealing to conservatives in California and conservatives in Massachusetts. And it would be a real 50-state election instead of a 8 or 9 state election, which was another reason for a small d Democrat to be in favor of big time electoral college reform.
Yeah.
We're
Cynthia-
about, yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry, Cynthia and I split our time between Texas and Massachusetts. And what you say is simply true. This is the first electoral cycle since 1988, when Lloyd Benson was on the ticket, that the national Democratic candidate seems to be paying a modicum of attention to Texas.
Yes.
But generally speaking, if you live in Texas and Massachusetts, you have no idea this presidential election, except that you do get all of the ads directed at New Hampshire.
And New Hampshire, that's right.
Because of the way the television markets work. This is crazy, and indefensible, I think.
Well, this is Cynthia, do you have any final words for the group?
No, but thank you very much. And we hope you enjoy the book, and we hope older people and younger people learn from it and discuss it.
Right, absolutely. And so everybody should go out and buy the book, and they should vote now if you're able to early vote in your state. And if you're not, make sure you vote in November. And then after you vote, you should read the book again, because the reasons that we're all vexed about this upcoming election, they aren't going away. And many of those problems would be better addressed if we had a better constitutional structure that would allow not just better governance, but a much greater level of small d democracy.
Is your son voting?
No, not yet. He's not yet eligible, but next year.
Too bad.
Well, on behalf of the library, I want to thank you, Archon, for masterfully facilitating this conversation, to Sandy and Cynthia for the book and the work that you do, and for being with us today. And just to echo again, please vote, and read the book. Thank you so much. I hope you all have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.